Hi there. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Elisa Sklar and I'm the Director of Marketing at GIS Planning. We're pleased to have Ed Burghard with us this afternoon to speak about an economic development. It's actually not about jobs. It's about enabling the American dream. A couple of notes about today's webinar. You will be muted, but you can easily communicate with me in the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Ed will take some questions at the end of the presentation. Ed Burghard is the creator of the Strengthening Brand America website, a free resource for economic development professionals to learn how to use a community branding as a competitive strategy. He is the former CEO of the Ohio Business Development Coalition, an EDO that was responsible for branding Ohio from late 2005 to 2011. During that time, Ohio won the Site Selection magazine's annual Governor's Cup Award 5 times. Ed retired from Procter & Gamble after a successful 33-year career and having been appointed a Harley Procter marketer by the company's CEO as one of its top branding experts. Ed has several articles published in economic development magazines on the topic of place branding. We are very happy to have Ed Burghard with us today as our guest presenter. Thank you very much, Ed. I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for taking time to participate in this GIS-sponsored webinar. As Alyssa mentioned, I'm Ed Burghard, and I'm the creator of the Strengthening Brand America website. And I'm only just going to do real quick on the website. It's a educational community of practice where I teach economic development professionals how to take private sector branding principles and reapply them in the public sector with the purpose of creating, a sustainable economy and improving the lives of your residents. Now, I came to economic development fairly late in my career. As you can see from my background, most of my career has been spent with Procter & Gamble. And it's there that I learned how to brand tangible products. Most of my career at Procter & Gamble was in the prescription pharmaceutical division. And it was towards the end of my career with Procter & Gamble that the CEO, and now our current CEO actually, A.G. Lafley, asked me if I would help Governor Taft of Ohio create an organization to better market Ohio for capital investment. And I took it on for two primary reasons. First, I thought, I was in my 50s, and I thought, wow, this is a really cool experience to have where I can start a company up and have no personal capital at risk. So, why pass that up? And the second reason was I was one of 20 some odd marketers at Procter & Gamble that created the brand building framework, which is the go-to-marketing model that the company uses globally to manage its product line. And I was very interested to see if that model could be helpful in branding what I perceive to be an intangible product, or a concept type product like a state. So I came into the exercise extremely excited to learn and experiment, and frankly see if I could add value to the profession. Along the way, I concluded that I could, and there were a number of things that I didn't really understand very well. And I'm going to give you one real quick example before we get into the presentation. My very first meeting, the Lieutenant Governor was talking about economic development and what the goals were for the state and so forth. And I was sitting in an audience of about 20 people, and the Lieutenant Governor kept talking about ED this and ED that. And just as a quick reminder, my background was pharmaceuticals, so medicines. And at a point in the presentation, I was really lost. So I turned to a colleague that was sitting next to me, and I asked, I said, I really don't understand what erectile dysfunction has to do with economic development. And that's when the person said, no, ED means economic development. So candidly, after that point, the rest of the presentation was far less interesting, but nonetheless, it taught me that I had a lot to learn about economic development. So with that as sort of the background, one of the things that bothered me a lot when I was running the Ohio Business Development Coalition was that I was frequently asked to explain how the work that the OBDC was doing contributed to creating jobs. And it bothered me because coming out of the private sector, my belief is employers create jobs, not politicians, not economic development organizations. So I had a hard time answering that, and I always kind of wobbled around with that, feeling very uncomfortable. And my answer to the media typically was, we're just part of a bigger team that all contributes towards the goal of creating an environment for companies to succeed in our communities. But I never felt good about jobs as a primary measure. And it wasn't until after I left the Ohio Business Development Coalition and started the website that I got exposed to a program that Xavier University was managing that was studying the American dream. And they had found a survey methodology, that helps quantify the American dream. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, aha, this may be a good tool to help economic development professionals and elected officials focus on what really matters and a measure that they could hold themselves accountable for actually impacting. And I came to believe that at the start. I've worked with them now for 2 years, and I actually do believe this is a better performance measure for our profession than year-over-year job growth. So I titled this presentation, it's not about jobs. It's about enabling residents to better achieve the American dream. I'm going to talk about the American Dream Composite Index, which is the way that Xavier University quantifies it. I'm going to show you how you can use it in site selection, talk a bit about the 2012 performance, and share some data with you there. I will tell you that the full 50-state data set is available on my website, and I'm going to tell you very, very quickly, everything on my website is free. You do not have to register or anything like that. It's an educational website. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use it in strategic planning for communities and the implications for your branding effort. And then I'm going to lift the tent flap a little bit and give you a peek at what's coming in 2014. So with that as a background, real quick on the survey itself, Xavier University got involved in studying the American Dream approximately 6-7 years ago now. And it was then that they decided they wanted to try to quantify it. Now, their reason for quantifying it had nothing to do with economic development. They felt that if they could quantify the American dream, they would be in a position to better forecast the direction of our national economy. And that was the driving reason for doing it. The good news for them is they've succeeded. And in fact, they have a number of investment companies and the Federal Reserve interested in using their data to help them get a better handle on whether our national economy is going to go up or go down. So the survey that they've created did the job that they wanted it to do. But after I talked with them and I showed them how their data could be used in economic development, they were extremely excited about another application of their data set. So let me explain what the actual data are, and off of that understanding, then we can talk about how you apply it in economic development. First, it's a broad, call it holistic measure of the American dream. One of the things Xavier University learned early on is that there is no single American dream. In fact, what they say typically is that the American dream is a composite of many individual American dreams. Their data also suggests that as we go through our lives individually, our relationship to the American dream, or the aspects of the American dream that we put more or less emphasis on, change. So I know how I thought about the American dream when I was in my 20s is very different than how I think about the American dream now that, let's say, I'm not in my 20s. So it reveals how people feel about their ability to achieve their definition in the American dream. Now, having said that, you can come up with a general definition, and I'll share one that Xavier University likes to use. They go out with a literal survey that has 139 statements to a random number of people across the nation. Typically 1,000 or more people respond to it, and on the basis of the responses to that 139 statements, they report back 35 what they call dimensions that make up the American Dream Composite Index. The actual composite score is interesting but it's the dimension scores that are the most powerful for our use in economic development. You think about the ADCI as a gauge of how well people living in the United States feel they are achieving the American dream. And that number does move over time, and it moves in response to economic conditions. So that's the data set, and I know you'll have a lot of questions at the end, and we can cover them. When we talk about the American dream, because it's hard for people to wrap their mind around the fact that it's actually a collection of individual dreams, the general way to position it is the way that James Truslow Adams positioned it. And I think this will ring true for all of you. It's a dream where, you know, your success is dependent upon your ability and achievement. So think of it as, you know, the harder you work, you should be rewarded. And that pretty much holds true when you look at the full data set on a national basis. There are 5 key indices within the American dream, and then, you know, the measured dimensions. They're categorized as economic, which is what we're all familiar with, and in fact we spend most of our lives focused on, but also well-being, a category called societal, which is how people feel about things like government and business and whether they're treated fairly, etc. A category around diversity, and think of it as more than just racial or religious diversity, because it often boils down to, can my ideas be heard, and, you know, will they be listened to? And then environmental, which has the fewest number of dimensions because it's the most obvious, but it's basically, you know, what's the pollution like in the air, food, water, and land where we live. It's reported out on a scale of 0 to 100. In June of 2013, the ADCI score was 64.7, which means nationally, we collectively believe that 64.7% of the American dream is being realized, or said another way, 35% of it is not being achieved. You know, and then it's reported out by major category. And those data are reported on a monthly basis. They're available on my website, and they're available on the Xavier University website. Key to enabling residents of our nation to achieve the American dream is to make progress on how people feel about each of these indices. And when you look at that, I mean, you know, at least on a composite basis, 35% of the American dream is left on the table. And as economic development professionals, our job is to figure out how to unlock the remaining 35% so that people living within our communities or our states or our regions feel like they're in a better position to achieve the American dream. So that's sort of the objective. Now, when I looked at the data, one of the things that I felt I needed to validate was, rather than, you know, just have the data as a point of interest, the data means nothing if it isn't going to impact the decisions that executives make on where to locate their businesses. So I launched a separate national survey to try to get a handle on what CEOs and senior executives thought about the ADCI data. And I tried to get an answer to a fundamental question of, you know, if these data were made available to you, would you actually rely on the data or pay attention to the data when you made your final site selection decision? And I was surprised by the results, to be candid. I did not expect the results to be so positive. I didn't expect that, you know, a number like 87% of the executives wanted to know what the score was. And to make sure that, you know, I didn't get any false read, or I didn't interpret the data incorrectly, you know, I asked questions like, if a community came to you and offered you a large incentive to relocate, but their ADCI score was lower than the community where your business already existed, would you consider moving? And frankly, I was shocked that nearly a third said they would be unlikely or highly unlikely to move. So that tells me that executives are going to pay attention to these data, and they're going to use it when they make the final decision around which community to locate their businesses. And that got me really excited because now, knowing that, it becomes actionable data for our profession. I always get asked, well, what's the data look like, and how do the states rank out when you look at this stuff? As I said before, I've got the entire 50-state ranking plus District of Columbia out on the website, so you can take a look to see where your state ranks. But here are the top 10 states. And what's interesting about this top 10 list to me is it doesn't line up exactly with the other measures that you read about in our journals. The ranking of state business climates, for example, doesn't line up this way. And one of the key reasons I think that those data sets don't line up is that they're measuring different things. And remember, this particular study measures the sentiment of people living in a location. It tells you how they think about their ability to achieve the American dream. So when you look at a ranking like this, it says the people in Montana feel like they are able to better achieve the American dream than the people living in New Mexico or the people living in Idaho do. What I can say about this data set is you want to be towards the top 10 and not the bottom 10 on the list. Now, here's the process that I recommend to economic development organizations when looking at the data and using it to guide some strategic decision making. The first is you got to get a handle on your competition, and that's to be real about who you compete with, and not just pick some idealistic state. When I was managing the Ohio Business Development Coalition, for example, my board constantly asked me to compare Ohio versus California. And the reality is, if companies are looking at California, there's a very specific reason. Typically, they want a West Coast location. And Ohio isn't competing against California. It took me a while to get my board to refocus their attention on states within the Midwest where Ohio was legitimately competing. And just as a side tip for you, the way I convinced them to rethink about the cohort to evaluate as a benchmark is I took a look at the records around lost deals, and I rated the states based on which states were competing with us the most frequently and which states did we lose to the most frequently when companies were looking to locate businesses. And that cohort that fell out of that became the competition that I defined for the state of Ohio. And if you have access to data like that, I would encourage you to at least take a look at it, because it'll either confirm what you already know and believe, and put a little data behind it, or you may be surprised that you're competing with a state more frequently than you might have thought. But once you've defined the competition, and you shouldn't have literally more than 3 or 4 competitors that you're looking at, then you take a look at the dimension scores for your location and the competing locations, and you index them, and you try to find where the big differences are, or what I call the gaps. And I focus on gaps of plus or minus 5 index points. There's no magic to the plus or minus 5, except it tends to really highlight the performance gaps, areas where you have a performance advantage or you may have a performance disadvantage. If you get smaller than 5, you tend to have a lot more data than you're actually going to be able to use and take action on. So with that, once you've identified where you've got your gaps, then you can create action plans, execute those action plans, and then year over year measure the improvement in your ADCI score relative to that competitive set. So it's a pretty straightforward process. It doesn't take a lot to actually execute this. The one thing that I would suggest that in addition to these 6 steps is before doing the actual action planning, that you consider launching local market research to better understand what the drivers of those gaps are, because that will allow you to better hone in on the action steps for improving your scores. Here's an example. I thought it would be helpful for you to see what what that process would look like if you executed it. I compared California versus Texas. This is actual data that came out of the study. And when you compare those 2 states, you look at the gaps and say, hey, California has an advantage on the dimension called melting pot personal and social identity, but is very disadvantaged across a number of other dimensions. And you can look for trends in the dimensions where things are disadvantaged. For example, access to education and educational quality probably go hand in hand. Not necessarily, but probably do. Financial security, home ownership. Generational progress has to do with, do I feel that my children are going to be better off than me? Material prosperity, that's, do I feel like I have more things or can afford more things, and so forth. There are definitions for each of these dimensions on the Xavier website. So whenever you have a question about the dimension, all you have to do is pop over and look at their website, and it tells you exactly what material prosperity means. So if you were California, you'd say, hey, we've got an advantage in this personal and social identity. Let me understand why. What is the driver of that advantage? Let me come up with an action plan to widen my gap, because that's an area where I can demonstrate that California is a better choice than Texas. But my gosh, I've got all of these disadvantages, so I would expect Texas to really be competing with me on one or more of these areas of disadvantage. And I've got to better understand why I'm at a disadvantage and come up with a plan to at least neutralize those points. In strategic planning, there are 2 primary questions that you have to answer. It doesn't matter what process you use for strategic planning. It always comes down to these 2 questions. Where do I play and how do I win? In economic development, we tend to answer the where to play question in terms of industries. And with these data, I'm suggesting that the how will we win question can be answered by focusing on categories or dimensions where you have advantages versus the competition, and then figuring out how to really drive those advantages to a greater degree. At the end of the day, it's all about delivering the American dream, and it's delivering it on these 5 different dimensions, and it's about creating a strategic plan with actual action steps that give you confidence that you're going to make progress in each of these 5 dimensions for the residents in your community. And I put this slide in as a reminder to me, if nobody else, that often when we see economic development organization strategy plan or strategic plans pulled together, the strategies tend to be focused more on satisfying the business community. You look at the supply chain in the business community and say, how can I make the supply chain more robust so that businesses, in that industry can improve their profit margin? When in fact, and those are perfectly fine questions and they should be asked and answered, but I also think that what we're really responsible for is making sure that the lives of our residents are improved. And attracting industry or supporting the industry that's in our community or helping entrepreneurism in our community is really all about enabling our residents to better achieve the American dream. So that's why I think this is what we need to hold ourselves accountable for. The implications of this is that our economic development organization strategic plans need to be more holistic, and instead of focusing only on one of the 5, we need to have action plans in the other 4 areas. One of the really nice things about using the American Dream Composite Index as the performance measure is that it's something that other organizations can wrap their mind around and see how they can contribute to improving the ability of residents to achieve the American dream. And I know in every community, the Economic Development Organization is not the only organization, working on this, but this gives you a common focus and a common measure to evaluate performance. And it's my experience anyway, when you have a common measure and a common goal, it's easier to get everybody on the same page, and it's easier to get everybody feeling like they're contributing meaningfully to a common end objective. In fact, that was the key for me when I was managing the Ohio exercise, to get all of the economic development organizations across the state of Ohio to sing from the same hymnal. And it's because we had a shared common objective. They could all see how they contributed to it in a unique way, and they were comfortable then in aligning part of their strategic plans to support the overarching strategic plan. And I'm confident using the American Dream Composite Index, you'll have the same kind of success that I did with the disparate organizations that you have to work across to make sure that your community's economy is as strong as possible. This is what it would look like if you were going to do a strategic planning process. I'm not going to walk you through all the steps, but essentially for every one of the 5 dimensions, you would ask, where are we going to play? How are we going to win? What assets do we have that will enable success? And what measurement systems do we have in place to give us information that says we're moving in the right direction? And not only would you do it for each of the dimensions individually, but then, because all of our hopes and dreams are limited by our budgets, you would prioritize across all of the different dimensions and work on those action plans that give you the greatest probability of taking a giant step forward. And that's a lot of hard work, but it's very interesting work. And once you've got a strategic plan designed like that, where everybody sees where they can fit in and contribute, the actual execution side becomes much easier, because people can have very specific tasks, and organizations can have very specific tasks on what they need to accomplish by when. I'm going to give you a little look forward, and then we're going to open it up for questions. This work is in its infancy. The 2013 or the 2012 data was the first data that I was able to get and to report out. If, just as a point of perspective, if the economic development profession were to try to duplicate these data, it would cost several $1,000,000 a year to run the study, update it, keep it current, etc. Xavier University is providing us these data for free. They have the hope that we will actually use the data to improve the lives of the people that live in our communities. The 2012 data is available on the website. 2013 data is going to be available in February of 2014. I always get myself confused on the dates, but remember, we're always looking backwards. So in February 2014, you can expect, if you visit my website, that I will post the 2014 or the 2013 data. What's important about that is it'll be the first time that I'll be able to report out year-over-year performance. So, Montana's #1 in 2012. In 2013, did they improve their score? Did they, go backwards? Did their ranking change, etc.? I'll be able to talk about that in a report. Because those data will be available, I'm also going to be publishing what I'm going to call a report card, so a state-level report card. And I believe that report card will be of interest to the media, because there are 36 states that have gubernatorial elections in 2014, and these data will be breaking in time to have an impact on those gubernatorial elections. I'm continuing my work with Xavier University. We'll be, publishing some comparison case studies. I have half a dozen right now on the website. I'll continue to increase that. I may have reported on your state already, so please feel free to visit it and see what those data say. I'm working with Xavier University to do 2 things. One is to get these data available on an MSA basis. And the good news is we believe that we will be able, for the first time with the 2013 data, to present city level ADCI scores for all the dimensions. And that will be extremely useful. What I don't know at this point is how big does a city need to be before we have reliable data. Xavier University will not publish any data that they are not comfortable is reliable. And they are working on coming up with a modified questionnaire, so not the full-blown questionnaire that could be executed on, like SurveyMonkey or a tool like that, that would allow you to go out and actually approximate the ADCI value for your own community. Unfortunately, it won't be able to give you the dimension data, but if you wanted to rely on your state data or the MSA that's close to you, their data, if you got your actual ADCI score and it was very close to either the MSA score or your state score, that would give your board of directors a little more confidence that relying on the dimension data from that reference point is appropriate for your community. So that's kind of a look at what's going on. Expect to see more publications and more press coverage of the ADCI as we move forward. So let me close with this comment again. I truly believe it's not just about jobs. Jobs are important, certainly. Increasing job opportunities year over year is something that our profession will always be working against. But now that I'm frankly retired, I know that for me, finding a job is not as important as it was when I was in my 20s. Making a value-add contribution to my community is. So you're going to find that when you start looking at your resident population, incremental jobs only touches a single-digit % of your residents, but enabling residents to better achieve the American dream is something that will benefit 100% of your residents. And I do think we ought to, as a profession, hold ourselves accountable for enabling our residents to achieve the American dream. Few resources for you. My website, clearly please jump on it. There's case studies. I've got blog posts out there that you can read that talk about community branding and give insights. It's all free, and I would strongly encourage you to go look at that information before you engage an agency to help you with your branding efforts in your communities. The 2012 data is available in a report as well as a table, so you can go on there and download that report. Again, it's free. There's nothing that you have to do to get it other than click on the download. You can go to the Xavier site, which is the AmericanDreamCompositeIndex.com website, or you can email me if you want. I know that you'll have a lot of questions that I didn't answer in this presentation. Please feel free to send me an email and I will respond to you. If I was in your seat and a presenter gave an offer like that, little alarm bells would be ringing off in the back of my mind, and I'd be thinking, oh, he's looking to try to get leads so that he can get more business. But let me assure you, I'm an educator. I don't do local community work, so even if you wanted me to work on your community, I would decline and offer you some other alternatives. But you can have confidence that if you send me a question, I will respond, and there will be no strings attached to it whatsoever. So with that, why don't we open it up for questions?
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much, Ed. That is really fascinating to have a quantifiable, big picture perspective on issues that are really of importance and interest to all of us in economic development. I open the field to questions now. Anyone who would like to submit a question, please go to the question tab on the right-hand side in your panel, and you can type it in over there, and I will let Ed know what your question is. I do have one question to start us off here, and that is, what is a Harley Procter marketer?
Yeah, and that's a great question because it's a company thing, so not very many people know about it. But a while back, Procter and Gamble recognized that in some of our categories, we were losing share versus competition. And as they analyzed that situation, they found a common denominator, and that's often where we were losing share the worst. The competition had hired a former P&G brand builder. So we were basically competing against people that we trained. And to avoid that in the future, they created this title, think of it as a chaired professorship, called Harley Procter Marketer, and it's a global appointment. You have to be recommended by your business unit president. All the recommendations are reviewed by the corporate marketing officer and our chief executive officer. And at any point in time, there are no more than 12 Harley Procter marketers worldwide within the P&G organization. The three primary criteria, and they're relevant to this discussion. One is recognized knowledge of the field of branding and brand building. And that's not recognized by you, it's recognized by your peers and your managers. Second, a proven track record of applying the theory in building businesses. And a lot of people can meet the first two criteria. And then the third one, which typically trips people up, is a proven ability to teach others to do the same. So, it's my passion for that field, the brand building field, that actually led me to create the Strengthening Brand America website so that I could teach the economic development professional community how to leverage branding for local prosperity.
Okay, another question that we have is, why don't the other rankings line up better with the American Dream Composite Index ranking?
Yeah, it's really important to appreciate that, what the American Dream Composite Index is. And it's a measure of sentiment. It's how people feel about their position. Every other measure that I'm aware of that we look at, every other ranking, in our journals, are based on some sort of secondary measure, a quantitative evaluation. The business climate ranking, which just came out, is a perfect example. There's like a half a dozen, metrics that are used, and then they're consolidated in a way to rank the states out, and they're, supposedly metrics that are of importance to executives when they're evaluating locations. And that's fine. Those are, hard numbers, maybe not so hard, but they're numbers that people look at that influence their decision making. This is, how do people living in an area feel about their ability to achieve the American dream on a range of different dimensions. So it's sentiment. Typically what you need to do once you see the scores from this type of survey is peel the onion back a little more, do some local research to find out why people are in your community are feeling the way they're feeling. So this research tells you what they're feeling, but doesn't necessarily tell you why they're feeling that way. And the answer to the why question will vary depending on the local circumstances.
Okay, I have another question for you about how you think this kind of composite index might apply in other countries. Do you think it has relevance outside of the US?
Yes, and in fact, Xavier University is looking to expand this work to other countries, and that will have implications, on economic development globally. But because it's fundamentally a sentiment tool, it's the same challenge to ask people living in Germany, how they feel about their ability to make personal progress as it is to ask people living in the United States. What will likely differ is there may be some question differences, certainly. I mean, these questions were designed specifically for Americans, so you would expect that they'll have to remove cultural biases from the questions. And the standard scores, or what the national average, if you will, looks like, will likely be very different because it's in all probability going to be influenced by the type of economy that's at play. The answers from a communist country like China, I would expect, would be different than a capitalist country like the United States. But the use of the tool will be pretty much the same. So I would expect our economic development colleagues in other countries will be pouring through these data and maybe looking at how their country stacks up versus competing countries, and or how their country stacks up against the United States.
Okay, that's interesting. I think it's important, that distinction, that you're measuring sentiment or perception
Yes.
rather than the hard factors. It's very interesting. One other question here is, how do the researchers at Xavier University account for or control for local bias from respondents?
Yes, another good question, and one that I get a lot because, in fact, the way it typically comes to me is, hey, Texans always brag, so clearly Texas is always going to have, big positive scores. Um, when the questionnaire goes out, people are asked to respond as Americans. There isn't any question that refers to their state or their city. So when they're answering it, they're blind to that. So they tend to be answering based on their personal perception of their position in life. And the survey was designed specifically to eliminate that bias, and the researchers at Xavier University feel pretty good that they have eliminated it. When I've posted about this research before, that's a question that comes up often, and every time I've sent responses to the people that have asked it and said, hey, look, as far as the respondent is concerned, they're just asking as a resident of the United States. It doesn't matter where they're living. We, after the fact, go in and take all the Texans who responded and calculate a Texas value, and take all the New Yorkers who responded and calculate a New Yorker value. But going in, they have no bias other than they're American. So if you look at it that way, because they know they're American, you might say that the score might be a little inflated on a national basis.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that explanation. Are there any other questions? Anyone else who has any questions, feel free to type them in while we're waiting to see if there are any others. I just want to remind you all that a recording of this webinar will be made available and will be sent out to you as a link in an email that you should receive within the next couple of days. Please feel free to review it at your convenience, to share it with any of your colleagues. I wanted to thank Ed very much for his time and his presentation today. He had a very different perspective on issues that are really of interest to all of us. Thank you very much, Ed, for being part of our webinar.
No problem. If we have more time, the one comment that I'll make is
Sure.
that, expect that your elected officials will become increasingly interested in this data set. Once we start publishing the year-over-year performance, and I've been out talking, with different groups saying we need to hold elected officials accountable to the residents that they represent. This data set is a way to hold elected officials accountable. So as the 2012 data start rolling out, or the 2013 data start rolling out, and we can evaluate an elected official's performance based on whether the scores went up or down, people are going to start asking the elected officials, why is it more difficult where we live today than yesterday to achieve the American dream, and what are you doing about it? And I believe the elected officials will then turn to the economic development profession and say, help me answer this question. What are we going to do to improve the ability to achieve the American dream? So you should expect that elected officials will be your partner in coming up with action plans to help your community make it easier for residents to achieve the American dream.
Excellent. I fully anticipate we'll be hearing a lot more about this in the news media in the coming year, particularly with those elections coming up in 2014. Thank you very much once again, Ed. Thank you all for taking time out of your days to join us. And we look forward to seeing you again at future economic development online webinars. Thank you. Goodbye.